is logical operators. So what's a logical operator? A logical operator is anything that involves a logical question. So the first and most common logical operators are just anything that involves a less than, equal to. So, for example, this example here is 56 greater than 25, and all you need is a formula to do that, and you're going to get your response. Okay. All right. Hold on one second. I have another. I'm getting another. Okay. Oh, okay. Try to come in on the chat box if you can, and not on Dropbox, because I have to keep opening up to do that. Okay, but anyway, a little easier. All right. So the problem with these is that they will only give you a result of true or false. You don't have an ability to put anything else other than an answer of true or false. So the kind of next logical step up is an if statement. And the basic syntax, by the way, how many of you have used if statements? If you have, just put yes. Anybody used an if statement? Or at least know them? Good. Good. And, okay, good. Okay, so this is an if statement, and one of the advantages of an if statement is you have an ability to have different kinds of answers. So basically, the first part of an if statement is essentially a logical operator. Is something greater than, equal to, less than, and then if it's a yes, if the answer is yes, return this response. So it's after the comma, return the true response. If it's no, then return a different response. And there's, again, a lot of different kinds of uses of if statements, okay? So, it seems like almost everybody at least is familiar with them. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute, okay? But they're kind of the next level up after an if statement. And an if statement is fine if you have only one item. But what if you have like multiple items, okay? Then you need a nested if statement. And a nested if statement is an if statement within an if statement, okay? So here what I'm saying is the following. I have 1 being part-time, 2 being hourly, okay? All right. Mary Lou, you got to respond through the Join Me chat box, because every time I pull this up, yeah. So, again, maybe I'll show you in a minute how you actually would use this. But if you had, let's say you wanted to be able to select something different, the answer is hourly, right? You're going to get a different response based on what it is, with 1 being hourly, part-time, 2 being full-time, 3 being hourly. So what you need is, since you can only have one, either true or false, in an if statement, what you have to do is have an if statement where if it's false, you then have another if statement. And theoretically, you could go on and on. Now, you have 3 items, so you need a minimum of 2 if statements, okay? How many of you are familiar with nested if statements? Anybody ever do a nested if statement? Anyone? I'm just waiting for responses. Anyone do a nested if statement? Okay, so hold on a moment. Let me show you. Let me just make sure that I take a minute to kind of show you one. All right, I thought I had one done. Let me see. Already. I'll actually do one just straight, okay? So, for example, well, actually, here's one that I did already, okay? So here I had an example. It involved calculating sales tax for 3 different locations, okay? So one was Maryland, one was the District of Columbia, and they had different rates, okay? So what I would do is I would do a different if value based on which one I did. So for example, I might do equals if this column equals, you have to make sure whenever you're using a text conditional form, logical operator, that you put the items in quote. Then I'm going to take the rate of 6%, right? If not, I'll take the rate of 5.25. So here, I got 6%. If this were DC, I would get 5.75. Now, the problem with this is if it's blank, I still get 5.75. And the reason I still get 5.75 is the logical operator was if it's Maryland, otherwise it's everything else. What if I wanted a way of handling a blank? Then I'd have to do a nested if statement. So instead of 5.75 as my negative, I would come back with another if statement, right? If, go to the same column, equals DC, comma, and if it is, then pick the DC rate. Otherwise, and the way you tell it to go blank is by using 2 parentheses. Okay, so what did I do wrong? Oh, I need an extra close bar at the end. Okay? Now, it looks like I made an error, but let's see what it was. Oh, there's nothing there. That's what it is. Okay? So let's see. So if I have MD and I have DC, actually, did I wanted to make a mistake on the DC? Let's see. What did I forget to do? Remember, you need the parentheses, then it works. Okay? All right? Questions? You need me to go over that again? Now, theoretically, you could have multiple nests. So if you had to do like 5 different categories, you could have 5 different nests. This seems kind of cumbersome. Anyone disagree? You think it's kind of cumbersome? Okay, so I'm going to show you another way of doing this by using VLOOKUP. Okay? However, there are going to be times when you can do this. I just want to give you a little trick on this. The biggest challenge I always have with nested if statements is knowing how many parentheses to put at the end. Because if you have multiple nests, you need multiple parentheses. And I used to go crazy trying to figure out how many parentheses until somebody told me a trick. Count the ifs. So right here I've got 1 if and 2 ifs. So I need two parentheses. If I had, let's say, another if here, then I'd have 3 parentheses. So that's just a way of doing it. But there's a shorter way to do this. I put some examples in here. One of the reasons why I'm not spending a lot of time on this, I really want to focus on VLOOKUP and pivot tables. But you should at least be familiar with, if you know how to do a basic if statement, a nested if statement shouldn't be all that difficult. So do you want me to go over it again, or everybody's clear? Just tell me clear or not, so I know. Okay, good. All right. So now I'm actually going to show you a really cool use of a very simple if statement, not even a nested one. That's really, really cool. Because some people will look at these things and say, what can you really do with it? But I'm going to show you. So I gave you a little example here that I think is really awesome. Okay? So it has to do with a cash disbursements journal, and which could be anything involving, could be just even an expense journal. Okay? So the big challenge with something like this is, and I'll kind of just explain what it is. So I have my check number, my date, I've got my check number, my amount, my code, which is the categories here, okay, which could be your budget codes. And what I have to do is then spread the amount to the column. Now, I could manually do that, right? I could say if this is rent, I'm going to go and copy it over to here, but there's a couple of problems with that. The first problem is it's really rife with mistakes. So it's so easy for me to accidentally mean to put it under rent or utilities and ending up putting it under a different amount or typing a different amount. So here's where you can use if statements, just a very simple if statement. There's a lot of them, but it's a very simple if statement. So what I've done here is just to make this fancy is I put a little drop-down menu that involved the various numbers. And I had gone over that in some of the previous sessions, how you create a drop-down menu. But you could just actually just put the number in, like number 1 or number 2. So let me actually just do that manually. Let's say I put in the number 1. Notice that it spreads that amount over to the rent item. Let's say that I had put this to number 2, it spreads it to the utilities area. If I put it to number 3, it spreads it to office supplies, 4 to temporary help, etc. So the question is, how is it doing that, okay? And the key has to do with looking over here. What I have here is an if statement. And unfortunately, I can't make this any bigger. But basically what it says is this. If the code is a number 1, let's say for this one for rent, if the code is a number 1, then return me the amount. Otherwise, make that column blank. So here it's asking, is it the number 1? Right over here, it's exactly the same if, except instead of number 1, it asked, is it a 2? Here it says, is it a 3? Here it says, is it a 4? Here it says, is it a 5? So while there's a little bit of debugging to do just to make sure you don't make any mistakes, and what I typically do is I create one for the first one, and then I make sure that I lock the range, so when I copy, I don't have to keep doing the ranges, and then basically I just check it. And the way I check it is to just go like this. 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I could again have 10 columns, 5. Now once I know it's really good, then I copy it down to the full range of my spreadsheet. And now I have an easy ability to spread the columns. Okay? So how many of you were familiar with that? Or have seen something like this where you have to spread amounts across budget codes? Okay. Very cool. Now I could have made this even fancier. After I developed this with the numbers, I said, why do I need to have numbers? What if I just have in my drop-downs the actual items? Like rent and utilities. So you could either do it by code or you could do it by the actual names. And the only thing that's going to be different is what you put in the if statement. If you're doing it by number, you're going to refer to the number. If you're doing it by the name, you're going to refer to it by the name that you gave. But either way, whether you have the column be the item or not, and it's better to do it with drop-downs if you're going to put names, because it is unforgiving, and if you make a typo, it won't know how to spread the item. Okay, any questions? You want to see that again, or is that clear? Kind of slick. And there's actually a lot of uses for this. Even if I had to make a list where I needed to spread, say, assignments out between full-time, part-time, hourly, okay, you want to see it again, Melissa? It's really simple. I'll go up to the top and just show you how you do it. Okay? And again, just simple explanation. So each one of these columns has an if statement. So this first one says, if D4, which is the code column, is equal to a 1, then give me the answer. If it's not, then give me a blank. And the way you show a blank, because remember, under an if statement, The syntax is give me the logical operator, the equal then, greater than, and then tell me what happens if it's true, tell me what happens if it's false. So basically what I'm saying is if this is a 1, then give me this amount. If it's anything else, leave this blank. So that handles this column. Now when I come over to this column, it's the same formula, except that instead of asking is it a 1, it asks is it a 2. So if it's a 1, it's going to come blank. If it's a 5, it's going to come blank. If it's a 2 here, then it's going to put the item in. You got it? And then obviously here it's going to be a what? A 3, it's going to be a 4, etc. So I'm the first one to admit, I learned this a long time ago. It's really is cool. It's actually how I keep track of my expenses for my business. And I had kind of seen it in a formula book, but it does take a little bit of time to debug it, just to make sure you didn't make any mistakes, you know, and you've got everything right. So what is very common to do is when you're copying over, you'll end up with the number showing up in both because you forgot to put a 3 instead of a 2. But usually what I do is I do the first row, I get it all worked out, you know, and I make sure that it's nice and bugged out, and then I copy, you know, I just copy it down to the rest, and then I'm good to go. Okay, got it? And again, if you want to get fancier, you can use the actual words instead. But it's not a complicated application, but it is a very useful one. Okay? All right, so now let's go and look at VLOOKUP, which is a little bit more complicated and actually is a way to do many of the same things that we did with a nested if statement using VLOOKUP instead. Okay? And it's just a little bit more complicated formula. Okay? So first, let me just explain some of the basics. By the way, how many of you have used VLOOKUP? Anybody? Oh, good. Oh, okay. Some. All right. Good. Good. Lisa, what'd you use it for? Just out of curiosity. Oh, okay. Good. Good. All right. So let me explain the idea with it because it's really important that you understand what kind of data you can use a VLOOKUP for and what you can't. They say that VLOOKUP is used when you have a list of items. Now, there's a couple of rules about it, okay? The items have to be unique. And by unique, I mean that you can't have belts having 2 different prices. Now, you could have the same price on 2 different items. By the way, this one I wrote based on my martial arts hobby. These are all like martial arts supplies, right? So I could have like a belt, and that belt can only cost $51. But I could have belts, bow staffs, and something else also costing $51. But each one of these items must be unique. Okay? All right? They have to be unique. Okay? And that's really an important part of what this is about. It has to be unique. So interesting enough, later on I'm going to show you how you can create a VLOOKUP that will allow you to look at, for example, a purchase order number and determine who the vendor is. So you can do a VLOOKUP for that, but you can't do a VLOOKUP for vendor that will give you the purchase order number because you can have multiple purchase orders from one vendor. But each purchase order only is from, no, I'm not making any sense here. You could have a vendor that had many purchase orders, but each one purchase order would only be to one vendor. So it has to have a unique item, because what VLOOKUP is going to do is going to look up the item, and it's going to put the corresponding amount, and it can't do that if there's more than, say, there were 2 belts here, and they had different amounts. It won't know what to look up, and you'll just get an error message. Okay. The second thing that we're going to talk about is the difference between an exact match and a close match. Now, in most of the situations that we're going to look at, you're going to want an exact match, okay? But I am going to show you one example where you might want to have a close match. And that's where it's really cool, because to do logical operators here with a close match that'd be a very complicated formula. Okay, so let me show you this first VLOOKUP and kind of move from there. So what I have here is I have a lookup table. There's a couple of other things. Can't have any blanks. Can't have an item where there's no amount here. So it has to be filled in. So you have to make sure you have good data. And one recommendation that I always make is if you're getting data, like a data set off of, and a lot of times, by the way, if I'm doing VLOOKUP, I'm doing it off some other system, like an expense system or a payroll system. If you put the information into Excel, it's always a great idea to put it in, in ascending order, and just check to make sure if you've got any duplicates. Because the most common duplicate will be you'll have belts, and you'll have like belts with a space. And all of a sudden it throws it off. Do you follow? So make sure that you've got your data correct. Now, it isn't case sensitive. So I have an ability to type in belts, and it'll pull up belts even though it's lowercase. So you don't have to worry about that so much on the search, but you do have to make sure that you don't have two belts. Just a really important thing. Okay, so I'm going to just take you through the syntax, and then I'll show you how you set it up. Okay, so basically, and I'll kind of point to each item, and then I'll actually show you how you do it. So the first item you always have in your VLOOKUP formula is your lookup value. You're telling it where to look. What's going to be the basis for the search? So in this case, it's here, okay? Then you have to tell it what's the table, all right? And there are, again, some rules on lookup tables. The item you're looking up must be in the left-hand column. So, for example, if I had a column that included a whole bunch of data, I could look up this. I could look up based on this, but I could only look up items that were to the right of it. So here I have a fairly simple table, but I don't necessarily have to have the item I'm looking up be the first column, but it must be the leftmost column in what I'm searching. Does that make sense to everyone, or maybe I'm not making sense? Okay? So, for example, if I had before this just an item number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I could do my lookup table and ignore that. Because because when I'm going to select my range, I just wouldn't include that in my range. But I must have the item I'm looking up being in the left-hand column. If belts were over here, this wouldn't work. Okay? So in some cases, I might have to rearrange my data so that I'm moving a column over, so my search column is my left-handed column. Okay? That's a requirement. And also, we'll get to this later, if you're doing non-exacts, then it must be in ascending order. Here I have an ascending order anyway, but they don't necessarily have to be that way unless you're doing not accurate exacts. Like if you typed in BE, it would pick up belts. But if you're going to just base it has to be belts, then it doesn't matter what order they're in. Okay? So the first item is the item you're looking for. The next is the table. Very important when you select your table range that you include in it the titles. That's important, okay? So you wouldn't want to start your range here. You'd want to start it here, okay? All right? And then you have to tell it what column to return. So, for example, if it's going to take this whole lookup table, you have to tell it what do I want to place here. So when you're telling it what column do I want to return, you're telling it what column I want to return in the range you've selected. So here, if I'm looking at belts, I'm telling it I want to return the second column, which are the prices. Okay? And then I have to tell it whether it's true or false. And I'm going to tell you, in most cases, leaving it out is going to be the default's going to be true. You want to put in false, because false means it must be exact. And occasionally you want it the other way, but for the most part, it's best to have exact. It will only select it if it's exactly belts. Okay, so again, let me just show you the formula up here. So it's E20 is the belts. A21 to C31 is the table, and it's best once you select your table to lock it in so you're not going to run into a problem when you copy down with you being below the table. So make sure you either select it as a table or you lock in the range. And then, as the last item, you have to tell it what column you want to look up. Okay? So now watch what happens here. And I just did a drop down for this, but you didn't necessarily need to do that. Let's say that I had typed carrying case. What it's going to return is the price and the color. Now, of course, here it's selecting for column 2. Here it's selecting for column 3. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay, so another way of looking at it just simply here is VLOOKUP. It's the reference cell, it's the table range, and it's the column you want to pick. Okay? That's it. All right? So now let me just show you another use of this, maybe something a little bit more sophisticated. Okay? So right now, I've tried to pick examples that are like school examples. So let's say what I have is the following. I have employees that fit in different job categories. They're full-time. This is a term you wouldn't see in Mississippi, but it's civil service, in New York. So it's administrative, civil service, teacher, administrator, civil service, okay, part-time or full-time. And they have different contracts. And based on each contract, they have different amounts taken out of their medical, out of their pay for medical or dental, okay, based on their salary, okay? Everybody got it? So what I want to be able to do is spread these amounts. So I put a two-step in here because once I get the percent, I'm going to multiply it by the base salary. But look what happens here as I select an item. By the way, you get points. You notice these are all what? Actors and actresses and singers. Okay, all right, as if you didn't know. But anyway, let's look at the first item. Let's say that Taylor Swift is a full-time administrator. So now once I do that, it looks at full-time administrator. It says, return me column 2, which is the medical, right? And then once I do this, it's just a straight multiplication. Well, okay, got it? And then the same thing here. I didn't even need a different table. I just needed to tell it to look at a different column. Here you look at column 2, here you look at column 3. Okay? And there you go. If I had to do this with if statements, I would need at least 3 nested, I'd need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 nests to make the same thing work, and I'd need that for both medical and dental. So I'm able to knock the whole thing off in one of these, in one shot. Any questions? You want me to explain that again, or is that clear? Now, again, I realize I go over this. It's an hour. You have the spreadsheets. You have my template. You have the video. You're going to have an ability to look it up. So when you go to play with it, it's going to be a lot easier than me just explaining it. As long as you've got the basic ideas here, I think you'll be in good shape. You want me to go over it again, or you're good? Okay. All right, so let me just show you a couple of other ones. So here's just one. It's kind of just an interesting one. So here are my bank accounts. Here are my banks, and here are my account numbers for those banks. Okay? So, by the way, it's not a bad idea sometimes to just have it check, again. So watch what happens here. If I select a bank, it's going to return the appropriate account number based on what it is. Now, by the way, normally, if you did something like this, you would get, if there's no item, you would get an error. So notice up above, in this, I got these NAs. NAs means there was no number. So therefore, it shows NA. So if you don't like that, there's a way to get rid of it, okay? And unfortunately, you got to do another nesting. But basically, what you can do is this. You can use either one. You can use either if error, okay, or if NA. They'll both work here. By the way, if error is the general one. It works for everything. It says if there's an error message, okay, if there is no error, return the item. Otherwise, give me something else like there's an error. So, for example, here, it's the exact same VLOOKUP. Like here, you don't see the blanks. And the reason for that is because in the formula, I put an if error. So it basically says, if error, if the VLOOKUP is true, just give me that. If not, give me a blank. And again, the way you do a blank is with two parentheses. Another alternative to doing that would be to actually put a word there. So, for example, same thing here. It's if error, same basic VLOOKUP, and it says if for some reason there's no item there, then give me not found. Okay? And so what I did down here, that's why you're not seeing all the NAs over here until an item is selected. Or here, you're getting not found. All right? Any questions on that? So it's a question of how pretty you want things. You know, if you're just trying to do it to fill it out and you don't care, you can just do a straight VLOOKUP. If you want to get rid of, you know, getting like what I call the dreaded NAs until you actually enter anything, then you can use an if error. Are we good? Have anybody's head exploding yet? Okay, so I've got a little, kind of an interesting use of one. I kind of think this is cool. All right, so here and obviously it's a very small list, but I've created a little lookup for myself that will allow me to enter, it's like a little input area for myself, that will allow me to enter in a PO number. And it will tell me the PO and the amount of that PO. So I have all of my data, and maybe after I've done my data, I put this little thing on the top. So if I'm getting a call on a purchase order, I don't have to hunt through the files or sort down the list. I can just quickly enter the number, and I've created my own little search tool. So watch what happens here. Okay? By the way, I didn't get elegant here. I didn't leave the if errors. So you got those NAs. But look what happens. I'll pick any number, 102770. And what it does is it goes, okay, the company was Cranston and the amount was $18.65. Okay? And so how did it do this? Because this was my lookup table. And here it said, look here, check this table, return me the third column. Here you'd have to be the third column because the date is the second column. See, first column, second column, third column. And then here it would be fourth column. And I told it false because I don't want, well, I set this up. I could not do it based on amount because that would not be unique. It would not be unique. Okay? Oh, you're saying I messed up. You're absolutely right. I messed up. Correct. It should be column 5 here. Right. Thank you for keeping me honest. Okay, now it works. Okay, let's do it. 102767. There we go. I got the correct amount. Hey, thank you. Who was the one who spotted that? You guys are good. Right. So basically I put the what? I put the wrong column in. I had column, I should have had 1, 2, 3, 4. I had column, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. I should have had column 5. Okay? Everybody clear? Okay. Thank you. See, I did that on purpose just to see if you were watching. Okay. We're good? All right. Now, here's a fun one. This is kind of interesting. Just for this is fun. This is extra innings. on the same idea. And also, so I decided, I could really do like a two-way lookup of phone numbers, because names and phone numbers are unique, right? Especially if all the names were on a list, like a drop-down list. So watch what happens here. If I select the name, it pulls the phone number. Now with phone number, I probably have to enter it manually, right? And that returns me the name. Now, if I pick the phone number that was an incorrect number, then it's just going to show up blank, and I know it's an error. I could have actually, instead of doing the double parentheses, probably should be error or name not found. But you could theoretically create like a reverse phone number thing, where if you had someone's phone number, you could look up their name or vice versa. But again, these are kind of lookups via self. This isn't actually a half-bad idea for a lookup, okay? All right, any questions on that? So again, could you do some of this stuff with nested if statements? You could, sure, right? So here's an example of full-time, part-time, and hourly, right? I could do full-time, part-time, and hourly by creating a nested if statement. If it's 1, make it part-time. If it's 2, make it full-time. If it's 3, make it hourly with 2 parentheses. Or I could create a VLOOKUP. This is my lookup table. If it's a 1, return this. So what am I saying? I'm saying if this is 1, right, then check the table and return me column 2 and make sure that it's what? An exact result, and then I'm good, okay? By the way, I said I would give you an example of where you might want to have, if I can find it, where you might not want to do exact, okay? So this is kind of kind of the exception of what you're normally going to do. But let me just give you the scenario. I just put this together, by the way, so I'll send you the revision on it. It was one of my brainchilds from this morning. But anyway, okay, so here what I have here is a situation where people get bonuses based on how much they, let's say, on their sales. Let's say this was a sales person working in a department store selling cosmetics, okay? And based on your sales for the month, you get a different bonus, okay? So just so you understand, if you get between anything under 100 in sales, you get no bonus. If you get from 100 but under 1,000, you get $5 as a bonus. If you go over 1,000, you get 50. So you get what I'm saying? Now, this is why this gets complicated. If I wanted to do this as an if statement, with a formula with an if statement, I'd have to do that that it would be over 100 but under 1,000. I mean, it's again a messy if statement. But for VLOOKUP, it's a piece of cake, okay? And so what I've done here is in the VLOOKUP, okay? And I just did it for the VLOOKUP is the bonus. Instead of putting, and I put an if error so it would look pretty. So what I said is, if the pay is this, look at this table. But instead of doing false, do true. So here's why true is important. True says it doesn't have to be exact. So watch what happens. If I type 99, there's no bonus. If I type 100, there's a $5 bonus. If it's 105, it's a $5 bonus. If it's 500, it's a $5 bonus. If it's 1,001, it's a $50 bonus. So basically what VLOOKUP is able to do is say, if it's anywhere in between here up to the next drop, it's going to return me the item. So if you were in a situation like this where you were dealing with, if it's between 100 but less than 1,000, then you would want to go with a true here rather than false. Most cases you don't want that, you want false, but this would be one of those cases where you would want to have a lookup range. They call this a lookup range, where it's not just the exact amount, it's within this range. Any questions? I don't think you see too many of these examples in schools, but or in university, but you might. Okay, all right. So now let's go to pivots. We got about 15, 20 minutes left, and I'm going to take you through pivots, okay? So I've actually put together two pivot tables here. One of them is a pivot table that I developed before for a group in Connecticut I was doing. In Connecticut, they have magnet schools, which means that kids are tuitioned out of their regular high schools into like a regional school. It's probably, instead of say having BOCES run schools, they have these magnets. By the way, they are still a public sector schools. They're just a magnet school. And this is actually data for the magnet of all of the students that are coming into them from other districts. By the way, even though this is based on a magnet, if you were a school that had students feeding in, say because they were special ed kids into a program, it would really work the same way. Okay? So what I have is my data of my students. I just gave you their last names. I have the last name of the students. I have the town they're from. I have what program are they in, because even though it's a magnet school, they can be, it's a tech school, so they could be in computers, aviation, engineering, different majors, different specialties, and what grade they're in, whether they receive free or reduced lunch, which is a required piece of information, their gender, and what the tuition is. Now, the tuition is the same for each program. Computers is always $11,000, but it could be different for aviation. There may be more supplies, etc. Anybody clear on the data set? Okay? So once again, very important when you're doing pivots to understand something about the nature of the data. The data in a pivot table must be what's called transactional data. Now, we tend to think of transactional data in industry. Can you all hear me? Am I loud enough? I don't know. Okay, good. So we tend to think of data in industry as like sales, like each sale. But it would have to be where it doesn't have to be a sale. It could be individual, for example, expenses in a check register, but the nature of them is that each individual item has to be one item. So here, each student is an event, okay? And each event must be in the rows. So the category that classifies that event is in the columns, but the item is in the row. Each row represents a distinct item, like a particular sale of a car or a particular expense, etc. And there cannot be any blanks, and you have to watch out for duplicates. The most common thing that screws up a pivot table is you'll have old line, and you'll also have old line with an extra space. So if you're looking at it visually, they look the same, So I always recommend the first thing you do when you do your pivot table is do a pivot table by by an item like town. And if you're spotting two different towns, like you're spotting Old Lyme and Old Lyme, chances are the reason you're getting that is because there's an extra space, usually at the end, like it's Old Lyme space. So it looks the same visually, but the table doesn't know that, okay? So it could be any of the ones usually with text where you're going to find that out. Free and reduced lunch, you're finding you have free and free. That means that you have a blank, then you got to go back and fix your data. If you're porting the data out of something, say, like School Dude or a student management system, usually the system will clean that up and you should get good transactional data. But if you're having people manually enter stuff, it's not unusual to have a bad data set. So I'm just kind of warning you. So the first step you do when you're creating a pivot table is you're going to highlight all the size of your table. Now, by the way, there is no limit to the size of a pivot table, and in fact, very frequently, from a practical point of view, if you're doing this in a company or for a school, you could have a pivot table. The table itself, the data, could be thousands and thousands of rows. If you were looking at every single student enrolled in a college, you could have, for a year, you could have 3,000 items. Do you know what I mean? So you're not limited to the size of the list. And in fact, that's where pivot tables really become an advantage. I'm showing these relatively small tables because I don't feel like entering lines and lines of data, and you're going to see the same thing. But a lot of times the real data is big. It's all our checks for the year. It's all our purchases, every purchase order. So it could be, you could be going down 400, 500 lines. No big deal. Just make sure you select your whole range. So the first thing, and I already did this before, but just to take you through the process again, and then I'll kind of, go back to when I did. So the first thing you want to do is select your range. You definitely want to make sure here again that you include your title and that you don't have any blank ranges like going below, okay? And then what at that point you do is you go to Insert, and you go and you select Pivot Table. Now, when you do it, it's going to ask you where do you want it. Now, theoretically, you could put it in the same sheet. It's usually not a good idea to do that. It's almost always that you want it in a new worksheet. Not necessarily a new workbook, but a new worksheet. You want it on a different tab than your data tab, okay? But if you wanted it in a particular place, let's say you want it on the bottom here, you could tell it existing worksheet and tell it where you want it, like down here. It's more customary to put it in a new worksheet. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a new sheet. It's not going to give it a title, and I'm actually going to get rid of this in a minute, but we're just going to call it, let's say our new pivot data, new pivot sheet. Now at this point it's blank. It doesn't really have anything in it. So I'm just going to kind of fill it out and show you how you begin. So what you have is you have these four, by the way, okay. Anybody, okay, I understand. And by the way, as you know, it's recorded, so. Okay. So how many of you have worked with pivot tables before? Anybody? Because this way I'll decide how fast I have to go. Anybody work with pivots? Okay. Okay. So it's best to begin when you're doing pivots. By the way, we have a second session, so anything I don't pick up here, I'll kick off in the beginning on the next one, and we'll go deeper on this so we make sure we have enough time to cover everything so I don't cheat you, because I know that a couple of people like Jennifer wanted me to kind of dig deep on this. I promise I'll do that. So what it's best to do as a start when you're creating your pivot is to select a very key item like program or town, let's say, and place it in the row. Now, as it turns out, it did it here anyway. And then what you want to select is a corresponding, usually a cost amount that you're going to select, and usually have that as the values. So what I now have is a pivot table that gives me all of my towns. These are my towns, and these are and then I have the values, and then I have an ability to go in here and then say I want it in ascending order, rearrange my data, or I can say I only want to look at certain towns. And so now I have a nice little pivot table that just shows me my towns, okay? By the way, if you lose a lot of people freak out if they lose this. Don't worry. Anytime you go in a pivot table, you're going to notice these additional tabs, which is the Analyze tab, and just click Field List. Your list will come back. Okay? So now I have, in the columns, I have the towns, and then maybe I want one other parameter, like, for example, program. Well, it's logical if I had that in the towns, I'm going to want the program. I don't really want necessarily the values of the program. Okay? I want the program. Oh, that wasn't the one I wanted to do. I want the program across. But now I want to go back to having my tuition values. I don't want it. I don't really need the count. By the way, if you get an item you don't need, you simply take it out. There you go. So now I have my towns and I have my values, okay? And then I have an ability to do any kind of sorting. I can sort by grade, I can sort by town, I can, like that's kind of the basics of pivots. But for the benefit of a few people, and we will kick off at this spot later, let me show you where your next step would be in doing a pivot, okay? So once I have and this is already a table I have, one of the things that I have an ability to do is add what's called a slicer. Have you used slicers, Jennifer? Okay. So now I've got a slicer, and so I have an ability to just easily select which one, correct, build a dashboard, right? So now how do I build a dashboard with a slicer? Okay, so once I have a slicer, I can now go here. It's a little bit different in Windows, but I, for example, can say, let me create a little pie chart, right, by town. And so there's my pie chart. Now notice what happens. If I select computer instead of I begin to get a dashboard, right? Now, of course, that's a dashboard with only one item. But I could theoretically create a much more complicated dashboard. So, for example, here's a dashboard where I created one for each one of the programs, right? And here's a comprehensive chart for all of the rest. So you're right, I can create a dashboard, and that's probably where we'll pick up next time. By the way, I have another one that I put together here, which was, since I did one for K-12 schools, I did one for you guys on expenses for different items by campus. And what we're actually going to do is look at having a dashboard for supplies. And I'll tell you actually how you design this based on your campuses. By the way, did I get the campuses right? You can tell me because we'll pick up on this next time. Okay. So if I wanted, for example, to look at books, at paper, I would say, okay, that's paper, and it's for these campuses. Got it? And so we'll pick up on how you actually do that next time. That'll be our start for next time. I don't have a lot more to do on this, but just showing you actually how to set up these and maybe a little more nuance. Any questions you have, Jennifer, on the details? Have you actually done dashboards? I know it was one of the questions you had asked me about. Okay. Yeah, so the key is you can't really do a dashboard without a slicer. Okay? Yeah, you have to really create a slicer for each one. And then because this is a pie chart, you can only really look at one data set. If you're creating one like this, you can pick a different range for your table. But that's the basic idea here. So, for example, if I zoom in on here, right? So this is by campus, right? But if I just wanted to look at, and again, I don't know how you're organized, but let's say you're organized into regions, and that was one region. Let's just take out the ones I don't. Let's do it the other way. Then I could easily, quickly just have that. Do you follow? Or if I only needed it for just one campus, I could do that. All right? So it's a little bit of work to organize it, but basically once you do it. But you have to use slicers. Slicers and the dashboard go hand in hand. I'm still learning how to do really cool-looking dashboards, so I'm the first one to admit I'm not like a super pro at it, but that's the basic concept. Okay? All right. So thank you. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope I didn't blow anyone's head up for those who are new to some of this stuff. Again, you have my templates. You can look at what I did, and, maybe next time, if you have some specific questions, after you've had a chance to play with this, we can delve down. But I want to start next time specifically, opening up with pivots and spending a little bit more detail with that, so everybody just feels a little bit more comfortable with it in our second session before we move on to the next stuff. Okay? Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Whew. Boy, a lot of stuff to cover in one day. Have a good one.